So let's look at the topic of growing self-empowerment, because this program is called Emotional Empowerment. And I talked about this in the 7 characteristics of self-empowerment as to what signs and behaviors of self-empowerment are. And we know that the root of it is healthy self-worth. But what I realized, through, learning myself and looking at other people, observing clients, was that we have this spectrum of what I call empowerment. And on one end is what we could call disempowerment, where we feel like, there's a certain sense of hopelessness or despair or inability to change, or I can't do it, I don't know how, and which we could call disempowered. And on the other scale is empowered, where we just feel able, we feel capable, we feel strong, we feel that we can do. So on one side is like, well, I can't, and on the other side is I can. And especially if we're experiencing, for example, depression, often we will find ourselves, on the disempowered scale, feeling very hopeless, helpless, despairing. And this is because these feelings are at a very deep level inside of us. They happened, these little patterns were set up at a very early age, where something or some things happened in our life which took our power away. They took away our ability to feel that we could cope with life, or that we could manage difficult situations, etc. And when we're feeling disempowered, then we're often going to feel victimized, or be what is called the victim. A lot of people don't like that word, but it's a truth. We can feel victimized. And when we feel victimized, then we feel that, everybody is out to get us, that we don't have any control, we don't have the power to change things. We're at the mercy of XYZ person or XYZ situation, and we come back to this feeling of powerlessness. Whereas on the other end of the scale, which is the scale where we're wanting to move towards, we feel masterful. We don't feel at the mercy of other people. We don't feel victimized. We know that we can change things because we have a strong inner belief and a toolbox of techniques for doing so, to feel that we have the power to change what we want to change. And if we're down the other end of the scale where we're feeling disempowered, then often, until we become conscious, often we will blame. It's like a knee-jerk response to blame. Now, if you think of society at large at the moment, and especially if you think of the media and what goes on in the news, when something happens, that they're just way over on the left-hand side here. So, for example, if a plane crashes, immediately there will be like, well, who is to blame? Who's to blame? Was it the manufacturer of the plane? Was it the pilot? They'll always be trying to find somebody to blame. And this is very much the cultural mentality of our Western world. But coming back to, us as individuals, initially, when we're unconscious, and most people on this program will not be in this place, they won't be fully over the other side, but, you wouldn't be on a program like this if you were fully in blame. But initially, when we're in blame, when something goes wrong in our life, or somebody says something to us, whether it's a partner or a family member or a boss or whatever it is, when something happens to us, our knee-jerk response is, it's their fault. It's nothing to do with me. They're wrong and I'm right. And there's no taking of responsibility. And that keeps us stuck over on this left-hand side. And I want to reiterate that this is like a knee-jerk response, which we've trained ourselves into. There's no judgment. We should not judge ourselves for this or criticize ourselves. The most important thing that we need to do is to recognize it with non-judgment, with compassion, so that we can actually start to change it. Because until we fully recognize what's going on the left over here, we cannot move over to the right. The first step in all change is awareness. So there are many different types of, blame. It could be, I don't know, you're sent the wrong electricity bill and they overcharge you and you feel really angry and you get on the phone and you shout down the phone and say that, that it's all their fault. And yes, they may have made a mistake, but we still got caught in that, I'm right, you're wrong attitude. This is such a common mindset for a lot of people, and it's definitely something I've had to spend a lot of time working on. And what happens is that as we move across to the other side, then we start to take more responsibility. And actually true and complete self-mastery requires that we take full responsibility for every single thing that happens in our life. Now that may seem like quite a radical thing to say, because what happens is as we move over to this other side, we start to see the part that we play in events, and we start to own it and become conscious of it so that we can learn from it. So for example, somebody backed into me about 9 months ago in the car park, and I had driven past and I'd seen a space and I thought, no, I won't, I'll carry on. And then I got just past the space and I thought, no, I'll go back and take it because it looks pretty full in here. And I started backing up, and somebody I'd just driven past, and they hadn't had their brake lights on or anything, but they were in the car and I didn't know it, and they started to back out. And they went, and I was looking that way and they were coming from that direction, and they just backed straight into the side of my car. And I immediately thought, it's their fault. And, because, they should have been looking when they were going backwards. And I was looking that way, and, I could have looked either way, but, when you're driving a car in this side of the world, you look that way when you're going backwards, not that way, because you see out the car better. So, in a way it wasn't my fault, but in a way I was partly to blame. And we got out, and of course then, between the insurance companies, there was this thing of like, well, who's to blame? And initially I tried to make it that they were more, at fault because she hadn't seen me backing past her. But I could feel inside of me, Kim, that that's not the truth. You know that you had a part to play in that. And so I had to acknowledge to myself, and to the insurance company, that actually I had a part to play in it, and that we were actually equally responsible for what happened. And when I looked deeper at that situation, I could see exactly why it happened anyway. It was because I went, there was a car behind me, by the way, as I was driving along, and I drove past the empty space and then quickly thought, no, I'm going to take that space. And then I was trying to back up quickly so that the car behind me didn't take the space, right? So this was what we could call one of our patterns, because we have many patterns, a pattern of, selfishness or greed or whatever name you want to put on it, it doesn't matter. But it was like, I want to get that. And so I quickly was, reversing without paying enough attention to try and get that spot. And, and then that happened. So afterwards, I reflected and I thought, okay, what is the lesson that I need to learn here? Well, first of all, it's like I need to take responsibility for the fact that it was partly my fault, and the fact that I, was rushing to get into that space, and that's how I created a bit of a mess. I mean, luckily it wasn't too bad, but, I had to take responsibility. A lot of people would not have thought like that. They would have just kept thinking it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. So, I mean, this is just a very simple example of how we blame rather than take responsibility. Because in any interaction with another person, if we find ourselves in blame, we need to go away and ask ourselves, what is it that I'm not seeing here? What is it I'm not taking responsibility for? Because there will be something. There will be something. And it is not until we take full responsibility that we get the real lesson, and we also get the gem, if you like, the cherry on top of, of what life is really wanting us to learn. And that often involves us swallowing our pride, feeling a bit squirmy and uncomfortable, maybe feeling upset and having to feel some emotions. That's what, has to happen in order to, move to more responsibility. Now, also, when we're stuck more on the disempowered side of things, then our focus will be more external. It will be externally blaming that company, that boss, that person. Whereas the more responsibility and empowered we become, our focus becomes more and more internal. And every time something happens, we just ask ourselves, what is my part to play in this? What do I need to do differently? What do I need to change? So, for example, one of the things that I noticed for me, bearing in mind that our external world is a reflection of our internal world, is that if I ever thought that somebody was being arrogant, I would just turn it back inside on myself and say, where am I being arrogant? Okay. So, they say that when you point a finger at somebody, there's one finger pointing at them, but how many fingers are pointing back at yourself? So the journey from disempowerment to empowerment, which is a lot to do with what this program is about, because as I said, and I'll talk more about it, next time, but these disempowering behaviors that we have, rest on a bedrock of this low self-worth and self-belief and self-esteem, which lead to these behaviors of not being our authentic self, which then lead us to feel frustrated and build up emotions and symptoms and all that sort of stuff, and life problems. It's all about moving from disempowerment to empowerment. So we have to move from feeling victimized, from blaming, from looking externally to solve the problem, to being more masterful of ourselves, masterful of our emotions, masterful of our thoughts and feelings and actions, taking more responsibility and looking internally for the change. And that is what we'll be doing a lot in this program. And then as a result of that, we'll be building these levels of self-empowerment that I went through in the last lesson.